honourable members, distinguished guests, great honour for me to be here. So let me just give you a very quick overview in terms of why I'm actually sitting here. In March 2021, my institute, the New Lines Institute, undertook the most comprehensive study at that time on whether China had breached the Genocide Convention in its persecution of the Uyghurs. We compiled a team of 55 leading legal scholars from around the globe to examine the evidence. These included former ICJ judges, prosecutors, former ambassadors, former chair of war crimes tribunals, etc. And the conclusion they came to was very clear, that China was in clear breach of the Genocide Convention. And since that time, my institution has been looking to examine what further can we do on the Uyghur issue. And the most common thing that came up was always on the Uyghur Sanctions Act, the Forced Labour Sanctions Act. And that was always a very complicated issue. It was always difficult to kind of get your head around it and even find scholars that kind of really understand the depth of it. But most recently, with my interaction with various congressional committees, one of the things that transpired is that Congress is going to be focusing quite heavily now on the issue of transnational repression. And so based on that, being part of a think tank, we want to get ahead of the curve. I've decided to create a transnational repression working group. This will be a group of scholars from across the globe who are going to examine the issue of transnational repression. Now, the first thing I realised that we have to do on this issue of transnational repression is to actually create a working definition, because there is no actual universally accepted definition. Every institution has its own understanding of what transnational repression is, and this creates huge complications. The FBI has its definition, Freedom House has its definition, other governments have their own definition, and they all chop and change whenever they want, when it fits their agenda. So you say, well, look, this constitutes transnational repression in Canada, what's happened recently, and they'll push back and say, well, no, that's not actually transnational repression. That's just legitimate lobbying that every country does. Yes, okay, they're a bit aggressive, the CCP, but that's all legitimate. So we have to create a definition. So this is my first task, is that we've put together a team of scholars looking at this. We're going to create a very sharp definition. Many of you are actually part of this. It's good to see all of you, and we are going to then kind of socialise it and then try to get this traction. Because transnational repression, ladies and gentlemen, is not actually illegal under any national or international law. So the actual violations, individual violations, may constitute rights violations or crimes in themselves. But as a phenomena, transnational repression is not illegal. And it comes in many forms. Of course, assassinations, renditions are the ones that get the headlines. But the real transnational repression, which really grinds people down, is a much lower level intensity stuff. So stuff like stalking, surveilling, digital intimidation, and defamation, defaming somebody online. Now, if you went to the police with any of this stuff, you know, most of them will have absolutely no idea what to do. Or somebody is defaming me on Twitter, they made this story up about me, or somebody is stalking me, I'm getting digitally intimidated, members of my family, they really wouldn't know what to do. This is why you need a definition as the first step in order to make this to put this on the agenda of policymakers. And of course, it is not just persons, individual persons that are targeted, it's also institutions. So you have communication systems, educational establishments. You hear from many of the people here how your universities are being targeted, and you also have democratic institutions in their entirety, as we have seen in Canada and elsewhere. And this is on the increase because states are actually learning from each other in terms of how to do this. How do we project influence into another state? You know, in the past, it was possible that people fleeing from oppressive states would find sanctuary somewhere else, that they'd have a life relatively free from harassment. If you essentially became apolitical as a dissident, then more or less you could have a life relatively free. But the whole purpose of transnational repression is to indicate to everybody that there is no sanctuary for you, that you cannot even in a democratic free society, you will not be able to practice your rights. And this leads to depression and exhaustion amongst the dissidents. Now, China is pioneering many of these techniques, and they're exporting them. They're exporting them around the globe, and many institutions, even within our own democratic countries, are falling into line when it comes to this stuff, and much of it inadvertently. They don't realise they're silencing employees, telling them not to tweet or talk about social media, about free Tibet, stand with Hong Kong. All of this is exportation of Chinese values. When we brought first China into the World Trade Organization, if you remember, Bill Clinton said, when we open China up, China thinks it can censor the internet. That's like nailing Jello to the wall, and they all had a good laugh. But the fact is, China is essentially censoring the internet, and they are exporting their values across the globe, which is something that we thought that they will open up to us and they'll become more like us, but it's actually the other way around. And of course, none of this is new. We have seen this in the past. Gaddafi had a whole campaign of what he called the stray dogs. Stalin murdered Trotsky in Mexico, and you had Iran, a whole wave of assassinations in the 1980s. So none of this is new, but what's different this time round is essentially what I believe is why policymakers are interested in this issue more than any other, is because it violates state sovereignty. It violates state sovereignty, and this is something policymakers do not like. We've always had we have a general understanding of the Westphalian system that all states are sovereign, and when this undermines the national sovereignty of a state, it does not go down very well. And I'll just finish off by making 3 points in terms of why transnational repression is different today than it was in the past. First of all, much of this has been supercharged by technology. Technology was in the past, it was used by dissidents to communicate, to get their message out. So you had exiles living in London, you had exiles living in Paris. They could communicate with a mass of people in Iran, in Saudi Arabia and China. That technology has now been turned on its head. It's now the other way around. Now you can target individual dissidents. You can target using the same technology. And this research shows that 31% of the transnational repression digitally comes from the CCP globally. And this is because the CCP, China, has very unique technological capabilities. The app WeChat, for example, is indispensable, and that is essentially a mechanism by which they can track and control everybody. And I can talk about TikTok and others as well. So that's the first thing. Transnational repression has been supercharged by technology. Technology, which at one point used to favour the dissidents, has now been reversed. The second thing is the war on terror. Terrorist extremists. This is the only label you need to basically target somebody, whether it's an Interpol red notice or something. And it's no surprise that 78% of people that are targeted by transnational repression are Muslims. Because once you target a Muslim and you say, well, look, this person is an extremist, this Uyghur is an extremist, or he's a potential terrorist, the reaction is always, there must be something there. That we have to be cautious. And so it's always easy to target the Muslims, and Muslims are therefore much more vulnerable. The third point is that why is this different now? Now, who is the actual victim of transnational repression? And I would argue, obviously, many of you will say it's the Uyghurs, it's the dissidents, etc. But I would actually like to expand that. Most recently, I'll give you a very quick story. I was in Boston very recently, just this year, and I've been going on a book tour of my latest book, Authoritarian Century. And I've been speaking to Fortune 500 companies, law firms, etc. And the book essentially looks at the global trends over the next 40 years. Now, authoritarianism is on the rise, democracy is in decline. And so I was invited to this, one of the largest oil companies in the world, the board of directors, to come and speak to them. So I went to Boston, I was speaking to them. There were 8 nationals from Beijing in the audience, 8. And so they weren't Chinese Americans, they were just Chinese, they actually came in from Beijing. And I gave my speech and everything else. At the end of it, there was silence. And then this lady stood up from China, and she started shouting at me, saying, look, what you are saying is complete lies. None of this is true. China has no interest in Taiwan. Taiwan are our brothers, etc., etc. She stood up. As soon as she stood up, all the other Chinese nationals stood up and lined up behind her at the mic. Yeah, and the moderator had to step in and say, look, we need to kind of calm down everybody, etc., etc., yeah. Now, the interesting thing about that is that I spoke to the CEO of the oil company later, and he told me, he said, look, he goes, none of these people actually believe that stuff. We know them. We've known they're our colleagues for years. But the local consulate will get a report. The Beijing consulate will now get a report of you having come here and spoken. And then all of these people will be asked, what did you do? Yeah, what did you do when he came up and he started talking about Beijing and about the rise of authoritarianism, the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. So once the lady stood up, then all the others had to stand up as well. So I would argue that they are also victims of transnational oppression, because silence is no longer an option. You cannot be neutral in this situation. You have to show loyalty at all times to the regime, even if you are overseas. And if you are not, it will be reported back. And so this loyalty to the leader, you know, one could argue that is also a form of transnational oppression. I used to teach at the University of Chicago, and I remember half of my class used to be Chinese students. And in the class, they would never speak up. You know, they wouldn't. But then I would meet them all one by one for their assignments, and that's when they'll kind of speak up openly, because, you know, and they actually tell you openly that, look, if I say anything in the class, it gets reported back. I can't trust anybody, any other Chinese citizens. And so I would argue that in itself is a form of transnational oppression, and which is unprecedented. There is no longer an option for anybody to be silent. You have to show continuous, regular, measurable loyalty to the leader, to the regime, to the government. Otherwise, you'll be called up saying, look, why aren't you standing up? And then they'll get into the same trouble as those dissidents. And with that, I'll finish off and pass it back to the chair.
Yes, thank you, Azeem.